First thing Mara noticed was the smell. Not a bad smell exactly. More like the absence of any smell she recognized. No exhaust, no coffee, no salt air from the harbor she'd grown up near. The air in the enclosure was neutral, in the way that only engineered things can be neutral, stripped of accident and history, calibrated to some alien committee's best guess at what a human respiratory system required. Tasted like the inside of a new car. She had been breathing it for 11 days, and she still couldn't get used to it. She sat up on the sleeping platform. Not a bed, a platform, smooth and slightly warm, shaped by some material that approximated a mattress without being one, and looked at the glass. The observation wall ran the full width of the enclosure, floor to ceiling, 12 meters of it. During the dark cycle, it was opaque. But she had learned on day 3 that the dark cycle was not for her benefit. It was for the aliens. Whatever they were. She didn't have a name for them yet. Had assigned them one she kept mostly to herself. They did not see well in what she perceived as darkness. The dark cycle was their night. During human sleeping hours, the glass was clear, and the corridors beyond were lit and busy, and things pressed their broad, pale faces against the surface and watched. She watched back. That was the first habit she'd built deliberately. Not out of defiance, though it became that. At first it was just something to do. Something that felt like agency. She'd noticed by day 5 that sustained eye contact made them step back. Not afraid, more like surprised, as if the exhibit had blinked. She filed that away. There were 6 humans in enclosure 12. Mara, who had been a structural engineer with the ESA Kepler Belt survey team before the extraction. Ex-Navy. Broad-shouldered, who spent his first 4 days sitting against the back wall, with his knees pulled to his chest, before he decided to stand up and start counting things. Dawn, who had been a medical student, and who used a piece of scored wall tile to scratch daily tallies into the baseboard, behind the food dispensing alcove, where the surveillance angles were worst. Ray, who had been a long-haul truck driver, and who, of the 6 of them, seemed the least surprised by any of this. Lucy, who had been 16 years old when the extraction happened, and who had not spoken in 11 days, but who watched everything with the particular attentiveness of someone memorizing a map. And Chen, who had been a biochemist, who swallowed his first dispensed pill meal, and then spent 2 hours crouching over the dispenser slot, making small sounds that Mara eventually identified as laughing. Nutritionally complete, he'd said, when he finally stood up. Down to the micronutrient. They've been studying us for a long time. That was day 1. Mara had not forgotten it. The dispensing chime sounded. A 3-tone sequence that, she had worked out, corresponded to something in the facility's broader PA frequency, like a harmonic ghost of the main system. Tones meant meal. 2 tones, sustained, meant a visitor surge was coming and the lighting would brighten. 1 long tone was a warning she'd only heard twice. Both times followed by activity in the corridor that she'd catalogued without yet understanding. She got up. The others were already moving toward the alcove. That was morning now. The tone, the platform, the walk across the smooth floor in bare feet. The pills laid out in a tray like pastel-colored promises. Ray was already there, leaning against the wall beside the dispenser with his arms folded. "Green one's new," he said. "Different diameter." Marcus picked it up and looked at it. He had big hands and the pill sat on his fingertip, looking self-important. "Same coating material." "Chen," Mara said. Chen was already kneeling. He had fashioned a kind of lens from a curved fragment of the sleep platform's removable hygiene cover. It caught the light at a particular angle and acted as a crude magnifier. Took the green pill from Marcus and held it under the lens and made a small sound. "New capsule layer," he said. "Whatever's inside has different density than the standard whites. Heavier. See how it sits in the light? The diffraction's different." "What does that mean?" Dawn asked. "It means they changed something. Could be nutritional supplement. Could be something else." He set it back in the tray. "I'd want to not take it today." "They'll know," Marcus said. "Let them know." Chen stood and brushed his knees. "Knowing that we noticed is useful information. Us." Mara looked at the pill and thought about the observation wall and the way the pale faces stepped back when she held their gaze. She thought about Chen's laugh on day 1. She thought about the word exhibit, which the announcement system used regularly. And without apparent irony, in a translated frequency she'd grown able to parse by the end of the first week. Whoever had programmed the translation module had done a thorough job, which meant the translation module had been built well before the extraction, which meant this was not new for them. She picked up the green pill and put it in the small fold of skin between her second and third toe where a callus had formed. She had been putting things there for 5 days. The tray's sensor registered a removal. It didn't appear to register a swallow. Morning, she said, and dry swallowed a white one. The tour came at the second hour of the visitor cycle, which Mara had learned to identify by a subtle shift in the corridor lighting. The cold overhead strips warmed by about 12%, a concession to whatever the visitors preferred. She had started timing everything, not because she thought she could escape. Not yet, not with what she knew, but because timing was understanding. And understanding was the only resource she had that they hadn't dispensed to her in a tray. She was doing pull-ups on the horizontal bar that jutted from the back wall when the first group arrived. The bar was there for the exhibit, she assumed. Enrichment, the way zookeepers put logs in primate enclosures. She used it 200 times a day. She didn't think that was what they had anticipated. The visitors were. She found it difficult. She had a word she used in her head that she would not say aloud, because it felt like giving them something. They were tall, pale, bilaterally symmetric, in a way that initially seemed familiar before you noticed the wrongness. The joints bent in the wrong sequence. The faces were arranged correctly. Eyes, nose, mouth analog. But the proportions were just far enough off that looking at one directly for more than a few seconds has produced a queasy, vertiginous feeling, as if her visual cortex was trying to run a program with corrupted files. She had trained herself past the nausea. Practiced staring at them until her nervous system stopped complaining. Tour guide. She had seen this one before, with the particular dark stripe on its upper garment that she associated with some rank or function, stood at the glass and made sounds that the PA translated in a flat, informational voice. Enclosure 12 houses 6 specimens of the species, designate Homo sapiens, Waitress from the third orbital body of the Sol system's inner habitable zone during the most recent collection event. Specimens range from 16 to 41 years in standard cycle measurement. Note the specimen at the rearward enrichment apparatus. This behavior, repeated limb elevation using a fixed horizontal substrate, appears to be a form of self-regulation behavior common to the more physically active specimen types. Average sustained repetitions during an observation cycle, approximately 120. Mara counted in her head as she pulled herself up. She had already done 163 that morning. A visitor pressed against the glass about 2 meters from her. Broad face, the dark adapted eyes wide and pale. One of its upper appendages lifted and touched the glass from the other side. Lucy appeared at Mara's elbow without sound. The girl had been doing that for 3 days, materializing beside someone, and then just standing, watching, cataloging. She was 16, and she had already, in Mara's estimation, figures out several things that the adults were still circling around. Lucy lifted her hand and pressed it flat against the glass, 3 feet from the visitors. The visitor's head tilted. Lucy tilted hers back exactly the same angle, held it. The visitor made a sound that the PA translated, after a delay. Mimicry behavior. Second instance this standard cycle from this specimen. Note for enrichment modification log. Lucy's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something more controlled than a smile. She dropped her hand and walked back to the sleeping area. The visitor tracked her for a moment, then turned back to the guide. Mara hung from the bar and watched the whole thing and thought, we're being miscategorized, and they don't know that yet. And that is the most useful thing I know. Day 14. Marcus had been counting things, and he finally shared his count with the group during the dark cycle, sitting in the back of the enclosure where they had established through patient experiment. The audio surveillance was at its weakest. 17 sensor nodes, he said, keeping his voice level and quiet. 7 of them are in the ceiling grid, which means they're primarily looking down. Floor sensors are pressure-based. Weight distribution mapping, I think. Back wall has 3 nodes, but they're older hardware. Different composite in the casing. They might be legacy from when this enclosure had different occupants. He paused. The dispenser alcove has no visual sensor covering the baseboard lower left corner. Dawn found that on day 4, the alcove also has a secondary drainage access panel behind the nutrient lines. I measured it today. How? Chen asked. Marcus held up his thumbnail. He'd scored it at a precise interval against the wall tile over 2 weeks. Panel is 81 centimeters by 40. Drainage line runs to the facility's primary water reclamation system. The water reclamation runs under the main visitor corridor. Silence in the near dark. Can't fit through 40 centimeters, Ray said. Lucy can, Dawn said. Lucy said nothing. Shh. She was sitting with her arms around her knees, looking at the floor, and her expression in the dim light was the expression of someone who had already thought about this and gone several steps further. Shh. It's not an escape route, Mara said. Not yet. Not the way you're thinking. How are you thinking? Marcus asked. Mara pulled the 11 pills from the fold in her calloused skin, laid them on the floor between them. The green one was in the middle. Chen leaned forward. You've been holding these? Learning the facility PA system uses the same bass frequency as the dispenser tones, she said. The chimes are harmonics off the main broadcast. That's not an accident. It means the dispensing system and the announcement system share a control trunk, which means they share access architecture. You want to interface with their broadcast system, Marcus said slowly. I want to understand their broadcast system. There's a difference. She touched the green pill. Chen, if the coating on this is a different density, what can you extract from it with time and friction and the materials we have in here? Chen looked at her for a long moment. Coating itself is inert polymer. If there's a different compound inside, anything hygroscopic, anything that degrades under sustained low-level friction heat, I could potentially isolate a residue. Why? Because the dispenser slot is a two-way electrolytic interface. It reads the tray. If it reads the tray, it writes to the control trunk. If it writes to the control trunk, it can send signals up the line. She let them sit with that. I'm not saying we can reprogram their system. Saying, if we introduce the right kind of noise into the right interface at the right moment, we might be able to produce an effect. Something observable, something they can't easily explain. What kind of effect? Dawn asked. Panic, Mara said. Close enough to it. In a creature that has never had reason to think its exhibits were anything but passive. Day 17. Chen had been right about the green pill's interior. 2 weeks of careful friction against the scored tile, catching the residue on of the hygiene cover, revealed a crystalline subcompound that formed a micropaste when mixed with the trace minerals Chen had painstakingly extracted from the white pills over the previous week. What the compound's for, whether it was a sedative, a tracer, a hormonal modifier, they didn't know. What they discovered was that when a small quantity of the paste was introduced into the tray slot's electrolytic reader contact, it produced a sustained low-frequency oscillation in the dispense output signal. Loud, not visible. A signal that, when Mara and Marcus lay with their ears to the baseboard near the alcove during the dark cycle, they could hear translating up the wall as a barely perceptible harmonic hum, hertz above the ambient, consistent, unscheduled. It's talking, Chen said. It's whispering, Mara said. I need it to shout. She had been thinking about the observation wall, about the tour guide's narration, clinical and confident, filed away into whatever archives they kept, about how the translation module had been built before the collection event, which meant there had been surveillance before the collection, which meant, probably, likely, if she was reading the facility's schedule correctly, there had been study. They had studied humans. They had decided humans were categorizable. They were wrong. They didn't know they were wrong. And nothing in the enclosure had yet given them reason to reconsider. Mara thought about this the way she used to think about structural problems. A failing bridge doesn't announce its failure. It accumulates stresses in silence until it can't hold anymore. Question isn't whether it will fail. The question is which direction you want it to fall. Day 19, Lucy went through the drain access panel. She fit, barely, in the way only a slight teenager can fit through a 40-centimeter opening. Shoulders pulled in, breath held. The way she'd practiced against the wall for 2 days with Mara timing her. The drainage line was dark and smelled of recycled water, and something chemical and faintly organic that Dawn identified, from the description, as a biological treatment compound. Lucy spent 14 minutes in the maintenance infrastructure below the visitor corridor. She came back with 3 things: a handful of a fibrous material that lined the pipe joints, a small piece of component casing she'd worked loose from a junction box, and a number. "There's a secondary control node under the main corridor," she said, her voice calm, her hair damp. 6 meters in, junction marked with a glyph that matches the one on the PA speaker housing. The maintenance pathway branches. One way goes toward the east exhibits. One way goes toward what I think is the administration section. There's a light in that direction. Not tour lighting. Colder. More like workspace lighting. "You counted 6 meters, Marcus said. "I counted my hand spans," Lucy said. "My hand is 18 centimeters. I measured it yesterday against your thumbnail scale." She met Marcus's eyes and held them. Counted 33 spans. No one said anything for a moment. "She's been planning this since day 6, Ray said. And he was smiling, and it was the first time Mara had seen him smile. "Haven't you?" Lucy shrugged, but her eyes were bright. They had 11 days of what Mara would later call the preparation phase, and none of them were linear, because nothing under pressure is linear. There were setbacks. Chen's compound residue degraded when exposed to the drainage line's treatment chemistry, which meant the plan to introduce it into the control node junction required a reformulation. Dawn developed a respiratory irritation from the pipe material, and Marcus spent 3 days watching, her breathing in a way that made clear he would abandon the entire plan without hesitation if she got worse. She didn't get worse. The reformulation worked. The component casing Lucy had retrieved turned out to be from a lighting control submodule. And Chen, after 4 days of examination using the tile fragment lens and a patient methodology that Mara found almost meditative to watch, determined that it used an inductive feedback architecture, meaning if you introduced the right kind of current interrupt at the right node, it wouldn't shut the lights off. It would cycle them, rapidly, in an unscheduled, unexplained pattern that would, in a facility dependent on precise environmental control for its exhibits, read on every monitoring system as a cascade fault. "They'll know it's artificial," Chen said. "Yes," Mara said. "They'll know something in the facility caused it. Yes, they won't know it was us. Not at first." She paused. "Here is the thing. There is no protocol in a zoo for an exhibit that does this. They have protocols for escapes. They have protocols for animal aggression. They don't have a protocol for an exhibit that reaches into their infrastructure and makes noise." She looked at him. "The absence of a protocol is the most dangerous thing we can hand them, because it means whoever responds will be improvising, and improvising means mistakes." Chen looked at the component casing. "And if they respond by shutting down the enclosure, sedation, relocation? Then we have learned something about their response capability and timeline," Mara said. "And we are better positioned than we were." "That's very calm. I've been an engineer for 15 years. Everything fails eventually. The question is what you learn from it, and whether you built the failure in deliberately or whether it found you by surprise." She picked up the casing. "Prefer to build it in deliberately." Day 31. The Kakas fault went live at the 2nd hour of the visitor cycle. Peak traffic. Maximum alien presence in the corridors. It started as planned. The compound residue, reformulated and dried, and introduced by Lucy through the drain panel into the junction node beneath the main corridor, produced the current interrupt at the lighting submodule. The lights in the East Wing visitor corridor, 3 enclosures away from enclosure 12, began cycling, not dramatically. A slow, irregular pulse, like a slow heartbeat, like something breathing in the walls. PA system responded within 40 seconds. Not an announcement. A system's alert tone, which Mara recognized because it was a 4th frequency combination she'd identified on day 8, as distinct from all 3 of the tones she'd cataloged before. Frequency they used for themselves, not for the exhibits. The visitors in the corridor outside enclosure 12 turned toward the East Wing. Tour guide, the one with the dark stripe, made a sharp sound and the group moved. All 6 of them were at the observation wall. Marcus had his hands behind on his back in a posture she'd seen him use when he was working something through. Ray was leaning with one arm against the glass, head tilted, watching the corridor empty. Dawn was standing very straight, her face still, and Mara knew she was counting pulse rate. Chen had his hands in his pockets, and his expression was careful and exact. Lucy was 2 feet from the glass with her arms at her sides. And then the second part began. The lighting fault in the east corridor triggered the facility's automated monitoring acknowledgement, which, as Mara had theorized from the shared trunk architecture, sent a surge query through the PA control trunk. That surge query hit the mod dispenser slot reader in enclosure 12. At the exact moment Ray on schedule introduced a second quantity of the compound residue into the tray sensor. Using a method Chen had spent 4 days perfecting, the dispenser slot read the signal, was confused by the residue, attempted to send a tray removal confirmation to the control trunk, got noise back from the surge query, and produced something that no exhibit maintenance event had probably ever produced before. An unscheduled, signed outbound signal on the main PA broadcast frequency that emerged from the speakers in the main visitor gallery as 2 seconds of broken, harmonic, undeniably structured sound. Words. But not static either, pattern. It was the 321 frequency sequence of the facility's own chimes, inverted and overlapping. It lasted 2 seconds. It came from inside the exhibit infrastructure, broadcast outward. The corridor beyond enclosure 12 went very still. 4 aliens and still visible. Stragglers from the tour group. And all 4 of them stopped moving at once in the particular way that Mara associated. She had documented this over 31 days, with unexpected sensory input that did not match any categorized template. The way they stopped was different from surprise. It was something more like the moment before a categorization happens, when a mind holds itself open and doesn't yet know what it's holding. Lucy pressed her hand flat against the glass. The 4 aliens stared at her hand. She knocked 3 times, measured, deliberate. Then she pointed at the PA speaker housing on the corridor wall, and then she pointed at the speaker housing inside the enclosure, the matching pair, the shared trunk, the thing they had reached into. She held the alien nearest the glass's gaze and waited. The alien made a sound. PA translated it, delayed, in the flat informational voice. Specimen behavior unclassified. Questing specialist review. Mara allowed herself, for the first time in 31 days, a full breath. Not victory. They weren't close to victory. Victory was a word for people who had already solved the problem. And they had only this morning introduced the problem. What she felt was something more structural than victory. The feeling of a correctly identified load-bearing point. The satisfaction of a calculation that resolved cleanly. She had been a problem to them before. An exhibit, a specimen, a data point. Now, she was a question they didn't have a protocol for. Questions get answered. Getting answered meant getting studied differently. Being studied differently meant access, scrutiny, contact. And contact was the one thing a locked enclosure could not give you, but a confused research team absolutely would. The specialist came on day 33. Not 1, 3 of them, in lighter garments than the tour guides, with equipment Mara didn't recognize but could guess at. Instruments, recorders. Things built to measure rather than display. They stood outside the glass for 4 hours and watched the 6 of them do everything they'd been doing for 31 days. And they recorded it. And they conferred. Day 35, the PA spoke during a non-standard interval. Not a meal tone, not a visitor surge alert. The voice was different. Still flat but slower, as if the translation module was being operated manually, one concept at a time. Enclosure, 12 specimens. You produced an unscheduled broadcast signal on day 31. This facility requests confirmation of intent. The 6 of them looked at each other. Mara walked to the center of the enclosure. She stood where all the sensor nodes had the clearest angle. She looked directly at the observation wall and said, in a clear and careful voice, "We know how your infrastructure works. We know the chime frequencies. We know the trunk architecture. We know the drain access dimensions, the sensor dead zones, the lighting submodule feedback architecture, and the maintenance pathway branching points 6 meters below your main visitor corridor." She paused. "We have been in your facility for 35 days. We have not tried to escape. We chose not to. We have been learning." Another pause. We would like to discuss the terms of our reclassification. The PAI was sent for a long time. Long enough that Ray said, quietly, "You think they understood all of that?" "They built the translation module before they collected us," Mara said. "They understood every word." She was right. On day 36, the specialist team returned. 37, a different section of the observation wall depressed inward 3 centimeters. Not enough to be an opening, but enough to be a deliberate signal. A threshold, acknowledged. On day 38, a thin membrane speaker was installed in the indented section, and a new voice came through it, slow and not flat, inflected with something that the translation module rendered as uncertain, which was, she had been waiting for this, had bet 31 days on this. The first time an alien voice in this facility had been rendered as anything other than declarative. They were uncertain. She sat on the floor in front of the speaker. Because chairs communicated a hierarchy she wasn't prepared to grant, and she began to talk. Chen sat beside her with his fragment lens, and his pill residues laid out in precise order. Marcus sat behind her with his thumbnail scale and his counts. Dawn sat with the medical knowledge she'd been quietly building into a parallel catalog of alien physiological observations. Ray sat with his hands on his knees and his absolute unhurried readiness for whatever came next. Lucy sat at the edge and watched the corridor and said nothing and missed nothing. "Here's what we want," Mara said. And the membrane carried her voice out through the glass into the corridor and up the trunk into whatever records they kept. "We want to tell you about humans, all of it. Not what you observe, what we know. The difference between those two things is something you've been missing, and it's the most important thing you could learn." She let that land. "We're willing to explain it, in exchange for certain adjustments to our current arrangement." A long silence from the speaker. Then, slow and careful, "What adjustments?" Mara looked at the glass. 31 days of watching. The way the pale faces stepped back. The way Lucy's mimicry had gotten logged. The way a 2-second PA signal had stopped a corridor full of tourists in their tracks. The way an unclassified behavior had immediately triggered a specialist review. She thought about all of that and about the structural truth underneath it. They had built an exhibit for passive things, and they had put humans in it, and humans were, constitutionally, historically, at the level of deep biology, not passive things. "Start by removing the glass," she said. They didn't remove the glass that day, or that week. The negotiation, because it became a negotiation, conducted through the membrane speaker in sessions that grew from minutes to hours, took time, proceeded in circles, stalled on points of mutual incomprehension, and progressed the way all genuinely difficult structural problems progress. Slowly and then suddenly. The glass was removed on day 61, not the whole wall, a door. A door was enough. The door was enough because a door is threshold that opens from both sides. And a door between a zoo and the world outside it is no longer really a zoo at all. Marcus found out on day 64. When he walked through the door and stood in the corridor, and a tour group came around the corner and stopped. And he stood there in the corridor with his hands in his pockets and looked at them, and they looked at him, and nothing happened. No alarm, no retrieval, no response at all from the facility. And he walked back inside and said, "Huh," in the way he said things when his count came out right. Chen negotiated laboratory access on day 68, not because they gave it to him. Because he made the case, in the session that day, that the pill compound they detected on day 14 had been introduced without consent, that he was capable of identifying it and documenting it, and that they had two choices: give him the laboratory access or have their methodology documented and shared with whatever interstellar bodies governed collection events. He didn't know if such bodies existed. Apparently they did, and apparently this facility preferred not to involve them, because on day 69 Chen had laboratory access. Lucy spoke for the first time on day 73. Not to Mara, not to the other humans. She walked to the membrane speaker during an off-session hour and talked to the facility AI in clear, simple sentences for 11 minutes. Mara never asked what she said. The day after, the tour guide with the dark stripe was no longer leading tours past enclosure 12. Dawn was asked, on day 79, to consult on a medical question. She stood in a room outside the enclosure. A room that was not the enclosure, and answered the question, and came back and sat down, and was quiet for a while and then said, "They have children. Small ones. And one of them is sick." She paused. "I told them what I know. I don't know if it will help." She paused again. "But they asked. They asked us." Ray said nothing, which was Ray, but he put his hand briefly on Dawn's shoulder, and that was enough. Day 90. Mara sat in the corridor outside enclosure 12 with her back against the wall, and her legs stretched out and a cup of something warm that was not coffee but was warm, which was enough. The observation wall was behind her. The door was open. Through it, she could hear Chen explaining something to his counterpart researcher. Voice animated. That particular rhythm he got when a problem was resolving. A group of visitors came around the corner. 8 of them. The tour guide with the lighter stripe this time. New one. She didn't recognize the garment mark. And they came around the corners and saw her sitting in the corridor and stopped. She looked at them. They looked at her. She raised her cup, a small gesture, casual. Something she'd done 10,000 times in break rooms, and on scaffolding, and at project close-outs. A human gesture from a human world that had no equivalent in whatever they had trained the translation module to handle. 2 of the visitors raised their hands in something that might have been an echo. Mara thought. 31 days. 11 captured, surveilled, assessed, dispensed to, and then 60 days of talking, of making the case, being studied differently. The glass wasn't the wall. The wall was the assumption behind the glass. The assumption that you could put a human in a controlled environment and predict how it would behave based on observation. The way you might model a load-bearing column, or a tidal pattern, or anything that follows fixed rules. Humans don't follow fixed rules. Humans look at the fixed rules and say, "What's the structural weakness here? And what happens if I push on it?" She finished her not coffee. She stood up. She walked back through the door into the enclosure, which was not quite a home, but was on its way to becoming something. And she sat down next to Lucy, who was drawing on a piece of the hygiene cover, with a fragment of Chen's extraction residue. Drawing something careful and detailed that looked, from the angle Mara saw it, like a map. "What are you drawing?" Mara asked. Lucy looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the map. "The rest of the facility," she said. Mara looked at it. East Wing, administration section, the maintenance branches, the workspace with the cold light. Exits marked in a notation Lucy had invented herself. Scale derived from hand spans and thumbnail scores, and 33 careful counts in the dark of a drainage pipe. "That'll take a while," Mara said. "I know," said Lucy. "But we've got time now, right?" Mara looked at the open door, at the corridor beyond it, at the long, strange, uncharted territory of what came next. "Yeah," she said. "We've got time."